Hello children, welcome back to the English class. This is the fourth module. In this module, we are going to discuss the important questions from the chapter The Address written by Marga Minco, which will help you to understand the text better. Moving on to the first question. The first question is to comment on the title of Marga's story, The Address. The story has been aptly given the title The Address because the entire story moves around Mrs. Darling's address, number 46 Marconi Street. Mrs. Darling had taken away all the valuables from the narrator's mother. The narrator went to that address twice after the war, but she had a very bitter experience. She finally resolved to forget that address. So since the entire story is revolving around this particular address, the title is said to be very apt. Moving on to the second question. What makes the narrator go to Mrs. Darling's house twice? What was her experience there? So Mrs. Darling had taken away all the valuables of her mother for safekeeping. The narrator wanted to see and touch those things once because the narrator's mother was dead after the war and she wanted to recollect all those memories and she wanted to touch those things. In the first visit to Marconi Street, Mrs. Darling refused to recognize her. In the second visit, it was Mrs. Darling's daughter who opened the door. But this time she is really hurt and distressed to see the things kept in a tasteless and untidy manner. So she leaves the house without having anything from the house. Moving on to the next question. Who was Mrs. Darling? How did she rob or cheat Mrs. S of all her antiques and silver? So Mrs. Darling is an old acquaintance of Mrs. S. So Mrs. S is narrator's mother in this story. So Mrs. Darling turned up unexpectedly during the wartime. She suggested that the silver and other antique valuables would be safe in her house. She won the confidence of Mrs. S and carried away everything to her own house. Later on, she played foul and kept all those things with her, and she did not show any interest to give those things back to the narrator or Marga when she visited her house. I hope the answer is clear. Moving on to the fourth question. Now this is a extract from the story. Have you come back? Said the woman. I thought that no one had come back. So does this statement give some clue about this story? If yes, what is it? So this is one of the questions from your textbook. Let us look at the answer. The quoted statement gives us a clue about the story. It means that the two families were acquaintances who knew each other and stayed nearby. So during the war, many families left the land to take refuge in another place, while some of the families stayed back at the same place. So Mrs. Darling thought that the family of Mrs. S died during the war, and that is why she gave such a cold reaction to the girl who came to visit her. So we can understand that Mrs. Darling was actually happy because she was really satisfied and happy to have all those antique or valuable things with her. So she is not really interested to give all those things back to the narrator. So we know that they knew each other, but she did not show that emotion of knowing each other. I hope the answer is clear. Let us look at the next question. Why did the narrator finally decide to forget the address? So let us look at the answer. After the war, the author went to collect the things which belonged to the family. So the narrator or Marga went to see Mrs. Darling. But Mrs. Darling, who had taken away all the things, did not allow the author to enter into her house. Later, she tried to take another chance. This time, her daughter received her. The narrator entered and saw many things lying here and there. So her past memories stood before her eyes. She was able to recognize each and everything kept in Mrs. Darling's house. But soon she realized that the objects which are associated with the past had lost their value as being cut off from them, because she could not really feel that emotion again because it was kept in such a tasteless and untidy manner and it has lost all its value. The easiest way was to forget. Hence, she decided to forget the address rather than trying to get them back. I hope the answer is clear. Let us move on to the next question. The sixth question. Why did Mrs. S allow Mrs. Dorling to take away all her precious things to her house? Why didn't the narrator object to it in time? So let us see the answer. Mrs. S was of Jewish origin. So during the war, all the Jews were being evacuated from the country by the Nazi army. So there was no security of life and property. So Mrs. S allowed Mrs. Darling to take away all her silver and antique things for safekeeping. So Mrs. Darling was actually taking it for granted. But the narrator's mother was a kind hearted woman, so she did not have any problem in that. She thought that Mrs. Darling would keep everything safely. So the narrator could not prevent it because she usually came home only during holidays. Hence, she was not really able to resist these things. Let us look at the next question. What impression do you form of the narrator's mother on the basis of a conversation with Mrs. Darling and the narrator? Let us look at the answer. So, from this story, though she is coming only for a very little amount of time, we can see that the narrator's mother was a very kind hearted and generous person. She was also a liberal lady. Though she was fond of collecting valuable things, she is able to give all those things to Mrs. Darling for safekeeping. She was more worried about the physical risk to Mrs. Darling than losing them to her. So she was completely sympathetic and she was worried about others more than herself. She thought it as an insult to tell her friends to keep those things forever. So we have gone through all the important questions. We'll discuss further in the interactive sessions. Thank you all.